Somewhere in this country, there is a kitchen that smells like nothing you will find in a modern home. It smells like lard rendering slowly in a cast iron pan, like dried beans that have been soaking since last night, like something simmering on the back burner that has been there in one form or another since early morning. It smells like work and thrift and time, like a household that understood, without ever having to say it aloud, that food was not something that happened to you. It was something you made happen every single day with your own two hands and whatever was available. That kitchen belonged to your grandparents, and the foods that came out of it, the 10 foods we are going to count down today, were not unusual to them. They were ordinary, expected, part of the rhythm of a week, a season, a life. But if you placed any one of them on a table in a modern American home tonight, most people under the age of 50 would not know what they were looking at. Today, we're counting down 10 forgotten foods that grandparents ate, foods born from necessity, shaped by scarcity, and sustained by a kind of daily knowledge that modern life has nearly erased. Stay until the end, because the story of how these foods disappeared reveals something important about what we quietly gave away and what we may not know how to get back. Number 10. Chipped beef on toast. Thin slices of dried, salted beef stirred into a thick cream sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then ladled over white toast. This was a regular weeknight supper in millions of American homes from the 1930s through the 1960s. The beef came in a small glass jar and lasted months on a pantry shelf without refrigeration. The whole meal came together in 15 minutes on a stove that had barely warmed up. It appeared in military mess halls and hospital cafeterias and boarding house kitchens because it was cheap, fast, filling, and required nothing beyond patience and a wooden spoon. Soldiers who ate it during the Second World War brought the habit home, and their families ate it without question because it was warm and it was there. Chipped beef on toast faded when jarred dried beef became harder to find in mainstream grocery stores, and when the food culture of the 1970s began treating plain, flour-thickened cooking as something old-fashioned and embarrassing. The meal itself never changed. The culture's opinion of it did. And that, more than anything, is how a perfectly good food disappears. Number 9. Dandelion greens with hot bacon dressing. Before foraging became fashionable, before any restaurant menu ever celebrated it as a concept, ordinary American families in rural communities walked into their own yards every spring and picked what was growing there. Dandelion greens were the first green thing to come up after winter, gathered young before they turned sharp and tough, then dressed with something that cut through the bitterness. Hot bacon dressing was the answer, fat rendered from a few strips of bacon, deglazed with vinegar and a pinch of sugar, poured hot over the greens so they wilted and absorbed the fat and acid in equal measure. Nobody consulted a recipe for this. It was knowledge passed hand to hand, from a mother to a daughter along a garden fence or beside a stove, absorbed through watching rather than reading. It faded not because families stopped liking greens, but because the knowledge of when and how to gather them stopped being transmitted. When the grandmothers who knew were gone, the dandelions kept growing in the same yards. Nobody picked them anymore.
Number 8. Liver and onions. There was a time in America when liver was not the meal you dreaded, it was the meal you planned for. Beef liver, sliced thin, dredged in flour and cooked quickly in a hot pan with soft caramelized onions, was a regular weeknight supper in American homes well into the 1970s. It was inexpensive and among the most nutrient-dense foods a family could put on the table, dense in iron, in B vitamins, in protein. A modest portion of it did more for a working family's health than a much larger and far more expensive cut of ground beef. Liver fell from favor not because it stopped being nutritious, but because cheap processed meat made the economic argument for choosing it less urgent. And as the generation raised on it aged, The cooking knowledge, how to slice it correctly, how not to overcook it into something tough and gray, how to balance the bitterness with the sweetness of the onions, stopped being passed down. Today, most people have never tasted it. They are reacting to a reputation rather than a flavor. That is how quickly a food can be lost, not through any single decision, but through a generation that simply never learned. Number 7. Mock apple pie. This pie contained no apples, not one. It was made from soda crackers soaked in a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, then spiced with cinnamon and dotted with butter before being baked in a pastry shell. When it came out of the oven, it looked like apple pie, smelled like apple pie, and by most accounts of people who ate it without being told, tasted remarkably like one. It was born from the Great Depression, when apples were expensive or simply unavailable across large stretches of the country. A woman who wanted to give her family something sweet and familiar, something that felt like a small celebration in a year that had offered very little, reached for what she had on the shelf. Mock apple pie is one of the clearest windows into what Depression-era kitchens truly valued, not authenticity for its own sake, but the emotional function of food. The ingredient list was secondary. What mattered was what the pie meant when it was placed on the table.
Number 6. Fried salt pork with gravy. In the rural South, in Appalachia, in farm kitchens across the Midwest and Upper Plains, salt pork was the everyday meat for families who could not afford a fresh cut more than once or twice a week. It was sliced from the slab in the smokehouse, soaked briefly in water to pull back some of the salt, then fried in a heavy pan until the fat had rendered and the surface turned golden and slightly crisp. The drippings left in the pan became white gravy, flour stirred in, then milk added slowly until it thickened, poured over biscuits or cornbread, and eaten for breakfast or supper, or both. The women who cooked salt pork knew exactly how much to use, how to stretch the drippings across more than one meal, how to make one modest preserved piece of pork do the work of feeding a household through several days. That kind of practical knowledge did not come from a cookbook. It came from years of watching and doing. And when the conditions that required it lifted, the knowledge followed it quietly out the door. Number 5. Bone broth soup, the real kind. After a chicken was roasted or a beef shank was braised, the bones went into a pot with cold water, a quartered onion, a carrot, some peppercorns, and whatever vegetable scraps had accumulated over the past day or two. The pot went on the back of the stove and stayed there, barely simmering, for hours, sometimes all day. What came out was clear, savory stock, slightly gelatinous when cold, that became the base for the next pot of soup, the liquid for cooking grain, the thing poured into a mug for a sick child who couldn't keep anything else down. It required no recipe, only the understanding that bones were not garbage, that everything had a second life if you knew how to coax it out, and that the pot on the back of the stove was never truly empty as long as there were things to add to it. Number 4. Scrapple. In the farmhouses of Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic states, after autumn hog slaughter, the organs and trimmings that couldn't be smoked or salted were simmered together in a large pot until the meat fell from the bone. The cooking liquid and shredded meat were combined with cornmeal and buckwheat flour, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sage, then poured into loaf pans to cool and set overnight. The next morning, it was sliced and fried in a pan until crisp on the outside and soft within, served alongside eggs or drizzled with syrup. Scrapple was the proof in edible form that nothing from a butchered animal was wasted, that a skilled household could turn what seemed like the least valuable parts into something that genuinely sustained a family through the cold weeks of a northeastern winter. It still exists commercially in parts of the mid-Atlantic, but the knowledge of how to make it at home and the understanding of what it represented has retreated into the same quiet corners where all of this knowledge has gone. Number 3. Bread pudding, the survival version. Not the brioche version with whiskey sauce served in restaurants today. The original was made from whatever bread had gone stale, hard, dry pieces broken into a baking dish, covered with beaten eggs, milk, sugar, and cinnamon, then poured into loaf pans to cool and set overnight. The next morning it was sliced and fried in a pan until crisp on the outside and soft within, served alongside eggs or drizzled with syrup. The eggs and milk made it nourishing, the sugar made it welcome, the bread gave it body from something that would otherwise have been discarded. The restaurant version that survives today is cooking as art. The original was cooking as survival. Both are real. Only one of them fed families through hard years on very little.
Number 2. Dandelion wine. When there was no money for store-bought spirits and no shortage of dandelions in the yard, families across rural America made their own. The yellow petals, gathered in early summer, the green parts, carefully removed to keep the bitterness out, were steeped with sugar, lemon, orange peel, and yeast, then left to ferment for weeks in a crock or a glass jug set in a cool corner of the cellar. The result was pale gold, lightly sweet, gently alcoholic, and tasted to those who made it like something between a mild country wine and a memory of the field it came from. It required patience, attention, and the willingness to make something fine from what the season provided freely and at no cost. It disappeared when cheap commercial wine became universally available and the labor of making your own simply stopped making sense. What went with it was something harder to name: the quiet satisfaction of turning a weed into something worth sharing. Number 1. The full use of the chicken, every part, every day. When a family acquired a chicken, they did not simply cook it and eat it. They managed it carefully and completely from the moment it arrived in the kitchen to the moment there was nothing left. The best pieces, the breast, the thighs, were roasted or fried for Sunday dinner, the week's most important meal. The back and wings went into the broth pot the next day with vegetables and water. The broth became the week's soups. The liver, gizzard, and heart were cooked separately, sometimes for breakfast, sometimes stirred back into a soup. The fat was rendered and saved for cooking. The bones were cracked for their marrow. The feet, cleaned and scalded, went into the broth for the gelatin they gave. One chicken, 6 days of meals, every part of it contributing something: flavor, nutrition, fat, protein, until there was truly nothing left that a capable kitchen could use. This is not an impressive feat to describe, but it represents a discipline of mind, a relationship between a household and its food that is nearly unimaginable in most modern homes today. Not because people lack the ability, but because the system of knowledge that made it second nature was never passed down. It disappeared between generations, quietly and without ceremony, in the years when food became cheap and convenient enough that none of it seemed necessary anymore. Your grandparents knew how to feed themselves from almost nothing. They knew how to make a chicken last a week, how to turn stale bread into supper, how to use every part of what they had and waste none of it. That knowledge was their inheritance, and it was real, and it kept families alive through years that tested everything they had. The question worth sitting with, not with urgency, but with honest reflection, is a quiet one. Do you know how to do any of that? And if not, what happens to the generation that comes after you?